When learning a world at war, the standard learning curve is reasonably accurate. Slow at first, then faster, then leveling off. However, the up and down learning curve is also sometimes seen. In this video, we will follow the sequence of play in highlighting the most important rules. Research and production are explained in Rules 41 and 42, and in the research tables, which include the production rules for easier reference. Research is fun and makes every game different, but when starting out, it is easier to have a partner who can handle research, or use the historical research results listed in the historical events chart. Weather is important because mud, snow, and, in the Pacific theater, monsoons affect play. The weather rules are set out in Rule 24 and in the Russian winter table. Codebreaking, which only affects strategic warfare and naval operations, is fun and not that complicated, and can also be ignored in your first few games. Diplomacy is another example of a rule that new players can play without, instead implementing the most important diplomatic results as set out in the historical events chart. Diplomatic efforts often cancel out, but not always, depending on the players. The diplomatic rules are found in Rule 49 and in the diplomatic tables. The oil rules are complicated and detailed, but they raise the game to another level, as various alliances wrestle with oil issues and alter their strategies accordingly. Newer players can avoid the 8 pages of Rule 33 and the record-keeping associated with oil by simply ignoring oil, unless a more experienced partner can take on the oil management duties. After a few games, oil can be brought into the game. Basic resource points, better known as BRPs, are the currency of the game. We will look at them in a bit more detail later on, but at this point in the turn, BRP levels may be increased by BRPs from mobilizations, conquests, minor countries, and restored key economic areas, and Japanese and Western Allied BRP levels may drop due to transport shortages. A world at war is a war game, and so declarations of war are important. Declarations of war on major powers cost 35 BRPs, and declarations of war on minor countries cost 10 BRPs. The restrictions, exceptions, and qualifications are set out in Rule 50. During the movement phase, air units may stage up to twice their operational range. In this example, the German 5-4 Army Air Unit may stage up to 8 hexes to a new controlled airbase. Staging is often followed by counter-air attacks and air combat. These topics are both covered in short videos, which will help newer players understand Rules 18.52 and 19. Naval forces normally operate in task forces, as set out in Rule 20.16, both to conceal their exact location and to avoid cluttering up the map board. The task force rules are discussed in the second Malta video. Naval units may change base during the movement phase, subject to the range limits in Rule 21.36. Instead of changing base, naval units may patrol, which in effect is changing base to a C-hex. Patrols, and the carrier-based air attacks on enemy bases that sometimes accompany them, are discussed in the video on Pearl Harbor. The supply rules, all of which are found in Rule 30, are important. They are explained in detail in the first video on Malta. One-factor ground units may be air transported by air transports. Both ground and air units may be sea transported by destroyers. Air and sea transport is an aspect of movement. In the first example of ground movement, a German 3-3 infantry unit moves 3 hexes. Here, a German 4-6 armor unit moves 6 hexes. If the German 4-6 armor unit moved north, it would use 2 movement factors to move into the hex containing forest, so its maximum movement distance would be 5 hexes. Here a Russian armor unit, with its zone of control, blocks the forward movement of the German armor unit. Because it takes 2 additional movement points to leave the Russian zone of control, the German armor unit gets stuck whether it moves north or south of the Russian armor unit. The German armor unit could get behind the Russian armor unit by avoiding its zone of control, even though this would take it through a forest hex. Overruns are a special type of movement, where armor and mechanized infantry, aided by air, plows through a weak enemy unit. Overruns are explained in the video on Poland. At the end of the movement phase, stacking limits are applied. Normally, this is 2 ground units, plus up to 3 specialized units, although more units are allowed in a hex containing a bridgehead counter. The combat phase may involve offensive combat by air, naval, and ground units, and attrition combat by ground units. The most common air mission is ground support to assist in ground attacks. The most common naval missions are raiding and seaborne invasions, assisted by shore bombardment. Seaborne invasions are explained in detail in the videos on Norway and the Axis invasion of Malta. Naval combat, which occurs when a naval activity is intercepted, as explained in the first Malta video, is analyzed in the second Malta video. Airdrops, in which an air transport drops an airborne unit, are examined in the Norway video. There are 2 forms of ground combat, offensive attacks and attritions. Offensive attacks are resolved first. Offensive ground attacks are analyzed in detail in the video on Poland. Exploitation, as described in Rule 16, is a special form of offensive ground combat. A breakthrough is created, then unused armor units may stack on the breakthrough hex and move, forming an exploitation chain. Exploiting armor units may also attack, often with a combat advantage. Attritions are a more abstract, less dynamic form of ground combat, but they have several advantages over offensive operations. They don't cost BRPs, there is no risk of losses, and in some situations they may even be more effective than an offensive. Rule 14, which covers attritions, is well worth reading. Once combat is completed, some adjustments are made. Usually these relate to BRP levels and supply. Unit construction is covered in Rule 27. Combat losses and new units are built during the unit construction phase, usually in their home countries, but there are important limits on construction, and wearing down the opponent by inflicting more losses than can be rebuilt is one way to win. Units may be redeployed by both land and sea, following the sequence of play for the redeployment phase. The main constraints on redeployments are that units adjacent to enemy units may not be redeployed, and strategic redeployments are limited by the number of objectives and railheads in the vicinity. Victory is achieved by forcing the opposing major powers to surrender, and by avoiding surrendering yourself. Rules 54 to 62 cover this critical part of the game. Many major powers have resistance tables that determine whether they surrender. Russia and China never formally surrender, although they may collapse. Apart from reading the rules carefully, the best source on this topic is the detailed 2020 Convention report, especially for the later years. As referred to earlier, economics are central to the game. BRPs are acquired at the start of the year and are gained, lost, and spent during the year. The BRP costs of declarations of war, offensive operations, and construction are set out in the BRP costs chart. The year start sequence, which occurs before the spring turn of each year, determines the starting BRP levels for each major power each year, as well as how many diplomatic and research points they have. The basic concepts described in this video will get you started. but it's important to realize that many resources are available to new players learning the game. Many of these are linked through the A World at War website, including written articles and the videos we have referred to. War Planner allows many forms of remote play and also lets you watch other players' games. The A World at War discussion group is the best forum for rule questions and discussions of strategy and tactics. Finally, the very best resource is the World at War community itself, where you will find many players of all levels willing to help out and play.